Quota kids do not sit here. Margaret Kensington's voice cut through the cafeteria, sharp as a blade. Moments before, her hand gripped Amelia Thompson's arm with a force that made the 13-year-old recoil in pain. She yanked the child away from the center table and dragged her toward the dim corner by the trash bins. Each step a public reminder that humiliation had become routine for the minority children at Hudson Elite Academy. Amelia stumbled, nearly falling as Margaret released her with a dismissive shove that sent her tray crashing against the metal chair. The cafeteria erupted in soft laughter, phones lifted, eyes watching, and the cruelty of that small audience left a bruise deeper than any fingerprint on her skin. And in that instant, although the room did not yet know it, this single act of violence would begin the chain of events that would end Margaret Kensington's career, expose a system built on silence, and unravel the careful image the school had preserved for decades. Before going into this story, please take a moment. Tell me where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel, and give me a like. It helps the stories reach the people who need them the most. Alexander Thompson had entered the cafeteria only seconds before the confrontation, carrying a small brown paper bag filled with the simple sandwich his daughter loved on her birthday. He stood hidden behind a column, frozen by the sound of Margaret's voice, unable to move as he saw Amelia lift her hand to her face, wiping away tears she hoped no one would see. Her thin shoulders rose and fell in small, restrained breaths, the kind a child learns when she has cried too often in places where she is not supposed to cry. His heart tightened. He had witnessed discrimination across the country in his work at the Department of Justice, but he had never imagined he would see his own daughter pushed aside like a burden. The pain on Amelia's face forced him to swallow hard, calmer than he felt, and he lifted his phone out of instinct, his legal training guiding him toward the only weapon he had at that moment: evidence. Margaret moved down the line of tables with the same rigid precision she had enforced for years. She returned to the central area where the wealthiest students sat in comfort, smiling at their screens, eating meals served with small touches of privilege. Her voice softened when she greeted them. Then she glanced toward the far corner where Amelia now sat, shoulders curled inward, and her expression hardened. Malik Washington approached to refill his water, but Margaret blocked him with a casual lift of her hand and said, "Your diversity allotment is exhausted for today." Her tone was even, almost instructional, as though she were reporting a harmless rule instead of enforcing an invented punishment. Alexander kept the camera steady, his pulse loud in his ears, realizing at once that this was not a moment of lapse. This was a pattern, a system, one that required the complicity of adults who knew better. Charlotte Kensington and her friends sat nearby, watching Amelia with smug delight. One girl nudged her friend and whispered something that made their small circle burst into soft laughter. Charlotte lifted her phone, angled it, and began recording the scene as though the suffering of a classmate was entertainment. She posted quickly, smiling at her screen with the kind of ease that comes from never being told no. Amelia lowered her head, turning away from the lens, trying to disappear into her corner. Alexander felt the weight of every second. His daughter had spent months enduring this in silence. He understood that now with a painful clarity. He remembered a winter afternoon in Alabama when he was 10 years old, standing with his mother outside a diner that refused them service. The sign had been removed years before, but the message remained in the eyes of the people who turned them away. He had told himself as a boy that he would fight until no child lived with that kind of shame. And yet here he stood, in an institution that advertised excellence and equity, watching the same cruelty he had sworn to confront. He vowed silently that this moment would not pass without consequence, as he continued recording. Amelia attempted to rise from her seat, only to freeze when Margaret snapped her name in a sharp warning. The girl sat back down instantly, her fingers trembling around her fork. It was her birthday. She had dressed in her nicest sweater that morning, hoping the day would be quiet. Instead, she found herself once again in the shadowed corner, a place the students had come to call the quiet section. Though everyone knew its real meaning, the section for those who did not fit the image Hudson Elite wanted to display. A teacher walked by, saw the situation, hesitated, and then kept moving. Isabella Morales, young, overworked, and terrified of losing her job. She gave Amelia a sympathetic glance, paused as if preparing to intervene, then lowered her head and hurried on. Her silence stung, not because she agreed with the cruelty, but because she was trapped by the fear that kept the entire school complicit. Alexander's breath steadied as he filmed. Every second mattered. Every sound, every insult, every refusal of water, every shove, every laugh. He knew that when discrimination hides behind polite language or subtle gestures, evidence becomes the only truth that cannot be denied. His daughter's suffering, once silent, now lived on video, and he would ensure it reached the people with the power to act. Amelia finally looked up, and their eyes met. Her expression shifted in a single heartbeat from fear to relief to panic. She shook her head slightly, pleading with him not to make a scene. Terrified of what the school might do to her if he stepped forward, he nodded once, not in agreement, but in reassurance. He would protect her. He would not abandon her, but he would also not remain silent. What neither Amelia nor Margaret nor the watching students understood in that moment was that the quiet man with the paper bag and the recording phone was not just a father. He was a senior civil rights attorney with the power to activate federal action, and the footage he held, captured with steady hands and a burning heart, would soon bring an entire institution to its knees, for now. He simply kept recording, knowing that this day, this hour, this lunchtime cruelty, would mark the end of Hudson Elite Academy's spotless facade and the beginning of a reckoning no one inside the room could imagine. Amelia Thompson had not always walked through the halls of Hudson Elite Academy with her shoulders bent and her voice hidden behind careful silence. 9 months earlier, she had entered the school with hope, carrying the glossy brochure that promised inclusive excellence and believing every word her father read aloud with pride as he described the opportunities before her. A belief that began to crumble piece by piece until she learned that even the most polished institutions can harbor quiet cruelty. At the start of the year, she had been full of life, winning the school-wide debate tournament with a speech on ethical leadership, receiving applause that echoed through the auditorium, and sending her father a video of her holding the trophy with a smile bright enough to light their entire Harlem apartment. But within weeks, her joy began to fade as she noticed the invisible lines drawn around her and the other minority students. The first sign came when Charlotte Kensington told her, in a voice coated with false sweetness, that certain tables were pre-assigned and that Amelia might feel more comfortable in the corner where the other non-white students sat. Amelia laughed nervously at the time, not wanting to seem difficult, and moved to the dim area near the kitchen doors, unaware that it would become her daily prison. The cafeteria staff followed unwritten rules that separated students without ever announcing them aloud, and Margaret Kensington enforced those rules with quiet authority, asking Amelia each day whether she had the proper clearance to sit in the central area while never posing the question to white students who passed freely. By the 3rd month, Amelia stopped telling her father stories about her day, not because she wanted to hide the truth, but because she feared distracting him from the important work he did for the country, especially his ongoing housing discrimination case that demanded long nights and long travel. and she convinced herself that her suffering was a small price to pay to keep him focused on the injustices of the world. She ate lunch quickly, avoided attention, and attempted to shrink into the background so the staff would forget she was there. A strategy that worked only until the bullying grew bolder. Charlotte and her friends filmed her removing trash from her seat before sitting, filmed her dropping her books after being jostled, filmed her when she tried to eat alone in silence, and posted the clips privately with captions that mocked her appearance and her presence at the school. In the evenings, at home, Amelia sat on her bedroom floor with her phone pressed against her knees, scrolling through stories in the private Instagram group Black at Hudson, a space created by the 12 minority students who shared their experiences quietly, hoping someone might eventually listen. The group became her only outlet, a place where she confessed that she felt invisible unless someone wanted to laugh at her, and where she uploaded a short recording of Margaret saying, "We keep them visible for photos, separated for lunch," a sentence that wounded her deeply because it reduced her presence to a marketing tool rather than a person. She typed a caption that she deleted twice before posting. "I think they want us to be seen only when it helps their image." The group responded with messages of support, but none of them dared to speak publicly. They were children who had learned to survive by avoiding the spotlight that the school wielded as a weapon. The stress took a toll on Amelia's health, and her nights became increasingly difficult as she battled fear that tightened around her chest until one evening she collapsed on the floor of her room, unable to breathe, trembling as she tried to call for help. Her father rushed her to the emergency room, where she whispered to the doctor that it was only a stomach issue, terrified that if she confessed the truth, the school would retaliate once more. Alexander believed her explanation because he wanted to believe she was safe, unaware that the hospital bracelet she kept hidden in her drawer was a silent record of the toll Hudson elite had taken on her spirit. As the months passed, her grades slipped slightly, though still high, and she grew thinner, skipping meals because the cafeteria had become a place of dread rather than nourishment. She stopped volunteering for class discussions, stopped attending debate club meetings, and began walking with her head lowered, hoping to avoid the eyes that followed her. She convinced herself that she could endure the pain if she stayed silent, believing that speaking up would bring more harm than good. She kept a journal filled with small sentences she wrote late at night. "I want to be invisible. Today I sat alone again. I do not know how to make them see me as a person, and I wish Dad never picked this school." One entry ended with a short line she circled twice. "If I say anything, they will say it is my fault." Alexander noticed subtle changes but misinterpreted them through the lens of his demanding career. His days were filled with depositions, interviews, and urgent filings, and he spent weeks balancing travel with the pressure of a major Department of Justice investigation involving discriminatory zoning practices. When Amelia told him she was tired, he assumed it was typical school stress when she said she was not hungry. He thought she had eaten at school when she withdrew. He believed adolescence was beginning to shape her quiet moods. He trusted Hudson Elite's promises of equity and academic excellence because he wanted to trust the institution he had sacrificed to pay for. Convinced that the glossy brochures and well-polished mission statements meant something, he underestimated the cruelty that can thrive in polished spaces. He failed to recognize the increasing hesitation in her voice and the way she avoided eye contact when he asked about her day. He believed she was adapting, unaware she was slowly breaking. Yet even during her darkest moments, Amelia held on to a small, fragile hope that things might improve. She kept her debate trophy on her desk as a reminder of who she once was. She clung to memories of the early months when she walked through the school confidently, unaware of the invisible barriers that would soon rise before her. She told herself that she only needed to survive until the end of the year, that the summer would bring relief. She believed she would somehow grow stronger by remaining silent, but each day chipped away at her resilience until she felt like a shadow of the person she had been. When Alexander surprised her on her birthday by arriving at school with her favorite sandwich, she hoped for a brief moment of joy, unaware that the moment he walked through the cafeteria doors would be the moment her hidden pain became visible to him. Her silence had been meant to protect him, but it had instead shielded a system that thrived because she feared the consequences of speaking. And though she still did not know it on that morning, the months of suffering she endured would soon ignite a federal investigation, expose long-buried truths, and transform the future of Hudson Elite Academy forever. Alexander Thompson had canceled a full slate of meetings that morning, intending to spend a quiet lunch with his daughter on her birthday, unaware that the moment he stepped into the Hudson Elite Academy cafeteria would reveal the depth of the suffering Amelia had hidden from him for 9 long months. He walked through the polished halls with a modest brown paper bag in hand, holding her favorite turkey and cheese sandwich from the family deli in Harlem, expecting to see her smiling. But instead, he froze behind a column as he witnessed Margaret Kensington slap Amelia's hand away from the water fountain with a sharp smack that echoed through the room, sending a jolt of pain through the child's fingers and a tremor of humiliation across her face. Shock swept over him as he watched Charlotte Kensington shove Amelia from behind with deliberate force, spilling milk down Amelia's sweater as Charlotte's friends laughed, their phones angled to capture the moment as casual entertainment. The pain on Amelia's face cut through Alexander like a knife, yet even in the midst of his rising fury, his instincts as a civil rights attorney took command. He reached into his coat, tapped the record button, and held the phone steady. The camera captured 18 minutes of footage that displayed not a single isolated incident, but an entire system operating in plain sight. As Margaret directed students, her tone shifting from gentle warmth for white children to cold severity toward minority students. Alexander realized the cruelty was not accidental, not impulsive, but deliberate and structured. The cafeteria's bright center tables were filled with laughter, sunlight, and ease, while the dim corner near the trash bins held only fear, quick bites of food, and children who had learned not to raise their eyes. Every detail confirmed what Amelia had been too afraid to say. Amelia spotted him halfway through the recording. Her whole body tensed, and her eyes widened with a mixture of fear and relief. She stepped toward him, instinctively seeking comfort. But Margaret moved in front of her, blocking her path with a stiffness that suggested ownership rather than authority. "She stays where she belongs," Margaret said in a firm, measured tone. Amelia's voice came out in a whisper, barely audible, trembling as she said, "Dad, please go. They will expel me." The sentence shattered him. No child should fear reprisal for wanting to speak to a parent. He pulled her into a brief embrace, her small frame shaking against him, and he felt the weight of every day she had endured alone. When she stepped back, her eyes pleaded with him, but the pleading only fueled his resolve. Alexander stepped toward Margaret, his voice calm but sharp with controlled anger. "This is segregation," he said, "and it is illegal." Margaret met his gaze without flinching, her expression fixed with quiet arrogance. "It is called standards, sir," she replied. Each word dipped in disdain. Her confidence stunned him. Only someone who believed she was protected by the institution would speak with such boldness. He lifted his phone slightly, making it clear the camera was recording her. Margaret glanced at the device, then at the watching students, and smirked as though she believed nothing could touch her. Within seconds, Headmaster Richard Hawthorne appeared, his expression tight with practiced concern. "Mr. Thompson, you cannot be here without authorization," he announced. Alexander gestured toward Amelia and said, "My daughter is being abused." Richard spread his hands with feigned patience. "Your behavior is causing a disruption," he replied. He then looked to Margaret, who nodded toward the corner as if presenting evidence of misconduct. Richard's tone hardened. "You need to leave the campus immediately," he said. "If you refuse, we will call security and pursue trespassing charges." The word trespassing ignited a fire inside Alexander. He had seen school administrators use that threat before, against parents who lacked power, against families who challenged policies, against individuals the institution deemed inconvenient. But he also knew that his presence, his title, and the footage in his hand altered the meaning of the threat. He stood his ground and responded with quiet force. "Call them." Security arrived within minutes. 2 officers approached, attempting a firm but polite grip on his arm. Amelia rushed forward, trying to place herself between them and her father, but Margaret caught her wrist, holding her back. Alexander lifted his phone, camera still recording. As the officers escorted him through the glass doors of the cafeteria, he made no attempt to resist. He walked steadily, his dignity intact. But the pressure of their hands left bruises that would later become visible reminders of the moment the school crossed a line it would never be able to defend. The officers warned him that he was banned from campus indefinitely. "Your daughter's enrollment may be reviewed," one said, reading from a prepared statement. Her behavior today raised concerns. The distortion of truth made Alexander's jaw tighten. But he stayed silent. Every word spoken, every movement, every injustice was preserved in the recording he held. Once outside, he stopped at the bottom of the steps and turned toward the building, through the glass. He saw Amelia standing frozen in place, eyes red, shoulders shaking. A cafeteria worker guided her back toward the dark corner, as if the brief interruption of the routine had been an inconvenience that needed correcting. Alexander raised his phone, holding it high for one final frame of the cafeteria. The tables, the separation, the forced seating, the sharp contrast between privilege and isolation. His voice, recorded on camera, was steady and quiet. "Everything changes today." He walked toward the gate with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what steps to take next. He dialed his colleague Sarah Goldstein at the Department of Justice, informing her of the situation with clear, concise detail. She listened in stunned silence as he described the footage. "Alexander, this is a Title VI and Title IX emergency," she said. "We will move immediately." When the call ended, he stood still for a long moment, absorbing the reality that his daughter's suffering had remained hidden for months. His chest tightened with grief and guilt. He had dedicated his life to justice, yet he had failed to see the injustice under his own roof. Back inside the cafeteria, Margaret continued directing students as though nothing significant had happened, unaware that the video now stored on Alexander's phone held the power to dismantle her entire world. Charlotte posted the clip of Amelia's humiliation to TikTok with a mocking caption, unaware that in mere hours, her post would become evidence. Richard Hawthorne returned to his office and composed an email accusing Alexander of disruptive conduct, unaware that the message itself would later be used to demonstrate retaliation. Amelia sat in her dark corner, staring at her hands, her birthday forgotten, the room closing in around her. But even in that moment of despair, the air in the cafeteria had shifted. Something had begun, something unstoppable. And the people responsible for her suffering had no idea that the quiet father they had pushed out the door was carrying with him the evidence that would soon bring federal agents through those same doors, place handcuffs on wrists that had inflicted harm, and expose the truth the school had buried for far too long. Alexander Thompson received the official notice less than 3 hours after being escorted off campus. An email written in the polished arrogance of institutions accustomed to impunity. Headmaster Richard Hawthorne declared that Alexander was permanently banned from Hudson Elite Academy grounds due to disruptive and aggressive behavior, and added, in a tone masked as concern, that Amelia's enrollment was now under administrative review, a thinly veiled attempt to intimidate a father who had witnessed too much. The message landed in Alexander's inbox with the cold precision of a weapon, and he read it twice, his jaw tightening as he understood the strategy: punish the parent, isolate the child, and hope fear would silence them both. An hour later. The phone rang. A woman's voice, disguised and low, delivered a message without hesitation. You people never know when to stop. Alexander held the receiver in silence for a moment, then ended the call without a word, the threat lingering in the air like a stain that could not be washed away. He documented the call immediately, saved the audio, and forwarded the details to his Department of Justice colleague Sarah Goldstein, who responded within minutes. This is retaliation. We are moving forward. Meanwhile, in the digital corridors of teenage cruelty, Charlotte Kensington uploaded an edited version of the cafeteria confrontation to TikTok, framing Alexander as unstable and overreactive. She titled the clip, "Quota Dad Goes Crazy," and within hours the post spread among students who had never questioned the invisible boundaries of their school. The comments echoed predictable lines. He overreacted. It's not that serious. Parents like him make everything about race. The narrative Charlotte crafted was meant to drown the truth. But for the first time since entering Hudson Elite Academy, Amelia chose not to remain silent. She opened her private Instagram group, Black at Hudson, her hands trembling as she considered what she was about to do. She had spent 9 months swallowing her pain, 9 months hiding bruises of the spirit, 9 months believing that her silence protected her father. But now she understood the truth. Silence protected the people who hurt her. She uploaded her recordings. She posted the clip of Margaret blocking Malik from the water fountain. She shared the audio of Margaret saying, "We keep them visible for photos, separated for lunch." She wrote a sentence that came from a depth she had never voiced aloud. This is what we live with every day. Moments later, the first reply appeared. "We stand with you." Then another. Then dozens. And as the students began sharing their stories publicly, the hashtag #HudsonExposed appeared, small at first, then growing with a momentum that no administrator could contain, while the digital storm gathered force. Alexander sat in a quiet corner of a small Manhattan cafe, waiting for someone he hoped would come. Isabella Morales entered 15 minutes late, clutching her worn satchel and glancing over her shoulder as though every passerby might be watching. She sat across from him, her hands shaking, her guilt visible in the way she avoided his eyes. "Mr. Thompson," she whispered, "I should have spoken sooner." Alexander nodded gently, letting her gather courage. Isabella opened her satchel and placed a small stack of documents between them. Handwritten notes, cafeteria seating charts, internal memos that referenced image management and parent sensitivity concerns. At the top was a notebook page with Margaret's script written in neat cursive, minority reminders, lunch corner, water limits, bathroom log, compliance checks. Isabella's voice cracked. "I stayed silent because I was afraid for my job. But I cannot pretend anymore. What they have done to your daughter, to all of them. I cannot carry that." Alexander read each page slowly, his breath steady, though his heart pounded with the weight of her testimony. Isabella continued, "The administration knew. They told us not to interfere. They said discipline was necessary to maintain standards for our donors. I did not want to lose my position, but I am more ashamed of losing myself." Her confession filled the small cafe with a heaviness that felt both painful and necessary. He thanked her with sincerity that made her eyes well. You cannot undo the past, he said, but you can help protect the children now. She nodded. I will testify, she said, her voice firmer. Whatever you need. As she left. She glanced back with a mixture of fear and relief, knowing her life had irrevocably changed in that moment. Alexander gathered the documents, slipped them into his briefcase, and exhaled with the clarity of a man who had all the pieces he needed. Evidence, witness testimony, retaliation, and the unfiltered truth of a child suffering back at the school. The administration scrambled to control the narrative. Richard Hawthorne held an emergency meeting, ordering staff to maintain stability, a phrase that meant suppressing the rising panic among faculty. Margaret walked through the cafeteria with renewed authority. But even she noticed the shift. Students whispering, phones buzzing with notifications, teachers glancing at her with uncertainty. She dismissed it as noise. She had survived decades of controlling environments like this. She believed she would survive this one too. What she did not know was that Isabella had already forwarded the documents to the Department of Justice. What she did not know was that Alexander had spoken with Sarah Goldstein and submitted the full 18-minute recording. What she did not know was that legal protocols were already underway, and retaliation only strengthened the case. What she did not know was that her words, her decisions, and her cruelty were now cataloged with the precision of federal evidence. That evening, as the hashtag Hudson Exposed climbed into trending territory, Amelia sat on her bed with her knees pulled to her chest, watching comments of support appear from students she had never spoken to. Messages came from alumni who admitted they had endured similar treatment years earlier, but lacked the courage to speak. Parents began demanding explanations. Journalists sent inquiries to the school. The truth, once buried in dark corners, had broken free. Alexander entered her room quietly. She looked at him with eyes filled with both sorrow and determination. He sat beside her, touched her shoulder gently, and said, "You were never the problem." Amelia leaned against him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will they hurt us for speaking?" Alexander's answer came without hesitation. "They will try," he said, "but this time they will fail." He stood, returned to his desk, and prepared the final documents for what he knew must come next. He reviewed every detail of the recordings, every image, every piece of testimony. He drafted emergency filings. He contacted agency leaders. He sent the documents to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, adding fuel to a fire that could no longer be contained. And as the night deepened and Hudson Elite Academy attempted desperately to preserve its facade, Alexander knew that the weight of their retaliation had sealed their fate. The next day would not be a continuation of their routine. It would be the beginning of their reckoning. The federal raid began with a phone vibrating on a desk in Washington. Long before the agents in black SUVs reached the gates of Hudson Elite Academy, Alexander Thompson had submitted his emergency request under Title VI and Title IX protocols with the quiet precision of a man who understood exactly how federal machinery moved. And once the Department of Justice leadership saw the 18-minute video, the retaliation email, the anonymous threat, and Isabella Morales's internal documents, the response shifted from concern to urgency, triggering an interagency coordination call with the FBI, the Office for Civil Rights, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People that lasted 11 minutes, just long enough for the school's fate to be sealed. By early afternoon, 4 SUVs rolled up the manicured drive of Hudson Elite, their wheels cracking softly over the gravel as students pressed against the cafeteria windows. Unsure whether the scene unfolding before them was real, agents stepped out with badges displayed, their demeanor calm, their movements deliberate, their presence unmistakable. Inside the cafeteria, Margaret Kensington walked between tables with her usual rigid confidence. unaware that the next moments would end the authority she had wielded for decades. Richard Hawthorne was in his office preparing a statement about recent misunderstandings, believing he still had control of the narrative. But when the cafeteria doors burst open with the firm instruction, everyone remained seated. The illusion of control shattered. Students fell silent. Phones lowered. Forks froze mid-air. 3 FBI agents approached Margaret with purposeful steps that conveyed both professionalism and finality. She attempted a nervous smile, insisting she was handling lunch service, but her voice wavered when she saw the warrant in the agent's hand. "Margaret Kensington," the lead agent said, "you are under arrest for civil rights violations, abuse of minors, and obstruction of federally protected activities." The words echoed through the room. Margaret's eyes widened in disbelief. "This is absurd," she said, her voice quivering. "I have run this cafeteria for 24 years. But her history no longer mattered. Her actions did. The agents read her rights calmly and clearly, their voices steady against the rising murmurs of stunned students. Margaret tried to speak again, but the agent's hand gently but firmly guided her forward. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, her granddaughter Charlotte, seated at a nearby table, gasped audibly, her face draining of color as she realized the cruelty she had viewed as normal was now being exposed under the full weight of the law. The arrest of the cafeteria manager was only the beginning. 2 agents proceeded to the administrative building where Richard Hawthorne shuffled anxiously through documents on his desk. When he looked up and saw federal authority standing at his door, his practiced composure faltered. The agents handed him a search warrant, detailing the investigation into misuse of federal funds, racial segregation practices, and retaliation against a whistleblower. "This is an overreach," Richard insisted. Raising his voice in a last attempt at authority, "You have no right. We do," the agent said calmly, "and you will comply." For the first time in his career, the headmaster, who had hidden behind donors and prestige, found himself powerless. As agents began gathering computers, documents, and files labeled parent concerns, media strategy, and diversity metrics, Richard sank into his chair, watching his carefully constructed world unravel sheet by sheet. Back in the cafeteria, an agent approached the dark corner where Amelia sat, her breathing unsteady, her hands shaking beneath the table. She had watched the initial arrest without understanding what it meant for her. When the agent knelt beside her and said gently, "You're safe now, Miss Thompson." The words broke through 9 months of fear. Tears streamed down her face, quiet at first, then uncontrollable, and the children around her, so accustomed to keeping their heads down, began to lift their eyes. Malik Washington looked at her with a mix of relief and disbelief, whispering, "It's really happening." For the first time, the shadowed corner did not feel like a prison. It felt like the beginning of liberation. Minutes later, the cafeteria doors opened again, and Alexander entered, not as the parent they had expelled, but as a senior attorney of the United States Department of Justice. Wearing his credentials visibly around his neck, students stared, teachers froze. Margaret, now seated by the exit with an agent beside her, saw him walk in and lowered her gaze. The smirk she had worn just hours earlier now replaced by the hollow expression of someone who understood her entire life had changed in a single afternoon. Alexander stood still for a moment, absorbing the scene, the tables, the agents, the stunned silence, the children in the dark corner. Then he looked toward Amelia. She stood from her seat slowly, her face streaked with tears. He walked to her with calm determination, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said quietly, "It's over." Amelia collapsed into his arms, her body shaking as months of hidden pain poured out in sobs she could no longer control. The cafeteria watched in silence, moved by the moment they were not sure they deserved to witness. As agents continued gathering evidence and escorting staff from the building, the atmosphere shifted from shock to reckoning. Teachers who had stayed silent looked down at the floor, ashamed of their complicity. Students who had followed unwritten rules now realized those rules were neither harmless nor defensible. Some whispered apologies to classmates they had ignored. Others cried quietly, realizing the harm they had normalized. And in the center of it all, Alexander stood with the calm force of a man who had spent his career fighting injustice, knowing that this day would ripple far beyond the walls of Hudson Elite Academy. Outside, news alerts began to spread. Cameras gathered at the gates. Parents arrived in confusion and alarm. The school board, notified of the raid, issued a statement claiming they were shocked and deeply concerned, though the investigation would later reveal their knowledge of the segregation policies. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People issued its own statement, praising the swift action and pledging full support for the affected students. The country began to watch, inside the cafeteria, as the final agent exited with a sealed box of evidence. The room remained hushed. The dark corner, once a symbol of humiliation, now stood empty. The sunlight reached it for the first time that day, illuminating the space where children had learned to make themselves small. And as Amelia lifted her head from her father's shoulder, she saw not the cafeteria that had hurt her, but a room transformed by truth. The reckoning had begun, and there was no turning back. The trial that followed unfolded over 3 exhausting months, each day peeling back another layer of cruelty that had been quietly embedded within Hudson Elite Academy for years. And as the courtroom filled with parents, journalists, civil rights advocates, and former students, the nation watched the case of Margaret Kensington and Richard Hawthorne with a mixture of disbelief and outrage. From the very first day of testimony, the gravity of the harm inflicted on the minority students became impossible to deny. Malik Washington took the stand first. He spoke without anger, only quiet exhaustion. As he recounted the day he asked to use the bathroom during lunch, and Margaret denied him, telling him, "If you children want privileges, earn them." The jury listened as Malik described the moment he wet himself in front of 60 students because he was forced to wait, the laughter that followed, and the crippling shame that stayed with him long after he went home. His mother cried silently in the front row as he spoke. Then came 3 more students, each recounting humiliation disguised as policy, isolation framed as structure, and punishment justified as standards. Their testimonies formed a mosaic of suffering that no defense argument could diminish. Each child describing how the dark cafeteria corner became a daily reminder that they were unwelcome guests in a school that took federal money while violating the laws that governed it. When Amelia took the stand on the 15th day, the entire courtroom shifted. She sat upright, her voice soft but steady, her hands clasped together with care. She began with the day she won the school debate championship, speaking of how proud she once felt. Then her tone changed as she described the slow erosion of her confidence, the whispered comments, the forced seating, the water restrictions, and the morning she hid in a bathroom stall for 30 minutes because she could not bear another lunch hour in the corner. She paused to gather breath when she described the panic attack that sent her to the hospital, a moment she had hidden from her father out of fear that speaking would bring even more punishment from the administration. The courtroom fell silent as she said, "I thought if I was smaller, quieter, and easier to ignore, maybe they would let me belong." Her words were calm, but they cut through the room with the force of truth no one could turn away from. When Alexander looked at his daughter from the plaintiff's table, he saw not the fragile child who had suffered in silence, but a young woman who had endured more than anyone had realized. Margaret Kensington chose to testify in her own defense. an act her attorneys advised against. She spoke of tradition, donor expectations, and maintaining appropriate order among students from different backgrounds. She insisted she did not target anyone, though the jury listened with visible disbelief as she defended her lunchroom policies with phrases that echoed a past the country had struggled for decades to move beyond. "My family taught me standards," she said at one point, "and I upheld them for this school." Those words sealed her fate more than any piece of evidence possibly could. Richard Hawthorne's testimony fared no better. He tried to distance himself from Margaret's conduct, claiming he never received official complaints, only for prosecutors to present emails from teachers, including the one Isabella Morales had submitted, warning of the harm being done to students. Each email had been ignored, dismissed, or marked for internal handling. Isabella Morales' testimony became a turning point. She described the staff meetings where Margaret's authority was emphasized, the subtle threats about employment consequences for teachers who interfered, and the directives to maintain donor comfort. She admitted her own fear and complicity, tears streaming as she said, "I stayed silent when I should have protected them." The courtroom did not judge her with harshness. Her courage now mattered more than her silence then. The jury watched her with empathy, understanding the weight of her confession. The trial's final days centered on the misuse of federal funds. Prosecutors revealed how Hudson Elite Academy accepted more than $8 million over 5 years through equity-based grant programs meant to support minority students. Funds that were, in reality, used to upgrade science labs for the wealthiest students, expand the alumni lounge, and fund donor events. Charts, spreadsheets, and internal budget memos left no room for interpretation. The school's board had knowingly profited while marginalizing the very children the funding was meant to protect. Closing arguments were delivered in a packed courtroom. Prosecutors stressed that discrimination in elite institutions is often subtle, refined, and masked by language of excellence and tradition. But its impact is no less devastating. They argued that Margaret and Richard did not simply violate policy. They violated the dignity of children entrusted to their care. The defense attempted to portray the incidents as misunderstandings, isolated errors, and exaggerated accounts. But the weight of the testimony, the footage, the documents, and the lived experiences of 12 students made their argument fall flat. The jury deliberated for only 5 hours. When they returned, their verdicts were decisive. Margaret Kensington was found guilty on all counts: civil rights violations, assault on minors, abuse of federally protected students, and obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in federal prison, plus $1.5 million in restitution to each of the 12 victims, a ruling that rendered her bankrupt. She lost her pension, her title, and the legacy she claimed to be protecting. Richard Hawthorne received 2 years of probation, mandatory resignation, and a lifetime ban from working in any educational institution. His reputation dissolved overnight, leaving him without the shield of prestige he had relied on for decades. The consequences extended to the institution itself. Hudson Elite Academy lost $8 million in federal funding. The Internal Revenue Service revoked its tax-exempt status. Donors withdrew support. The entire Board of Trustees resigned in a single emergency session, each member stating they were unaware of the school's wrongdoing. Though evidence showed otherwise, the school's once flawless reputation collapsed with stunning speed, replaced by headlines that exposed years of hidden discrimination. When the judge adjourned the courtroom on the final day, Amelia stepped outside with her father. Cameras flashed, but she did not shrink. She breathed deeply, her shoulders no longer burdened by silence. Alexander placed a hand on her back, guiding her forward with quiet pride. Justice had taken months. Healing would take longer, but truth had prevailed, and the institution that once forced her into a dark corner would never again have the power to dim her light. 2 years after the verdict shook Hudson Elite Academy to its foundation. The school no longer resembled the institution that had once hidden cruelty behind polished hallways and donor-funded prestige under the leadership of its new headmaster, Dr. Evelyn Harper. The campus transformed into a model of equity that educators across the nation came to study, and every change in the building carried the imprint of the children whose suffering had exposed the truth. The cafeteria, once divided by invisible lines and silent rules, underwent the most symbolic transformation of all. Gone were the darkened corners, the separated tables, the strict surveillance of movement. In their place stood a bright, open dining hall renamed Amelia Thompson Equity Hall, a space filled with natural light, circular seating that encouraged connection, and a plaque at the entrance that read, "No child will ever eat in the shadows again." Amelia had stood beside Dr. Harper at the unveiling ceremony, now 15 years old, taller, steadier, and bearing the quiet strength of someone who had survived what others could not see. She watched as younger students entered the renovated hall for the first time, their steps light, their voices free, and felt a sense of peace she had once believed unreachable. The transformation of Hudson Elite extended far beyond its cafeteria. Dr. Harper instituted sweeping reforms, mandatory equity training for all staff, transparent reporting systems for all complaints, monthly community listening sessions, and a new Student Dignity Council that allowed children to speak directly to administrators about their experiences. The school's disciplinary policies were rewritten from the ground up, replacing punitive practices with restorative approaches that emphasized accountability and healing. The school's new curriculum included units on civil rights history, implicit bias, and cultural literacy, ensuring that every student graduated with a deeper understanding of justice than the institution had once upheld. Teachers who had once feared speaking out now found their voices, empowered by leadership that valued truth over appearances. The students who had testified in court became mentors to younger classmates, their stories transforming into tools of protection rather than marks of shame. On the national stage, the impact of the case reverberated through legislative chambers and educational institutions. The federal government, moved by the uncovering of hidden segregation in an elite private school, passed the Equity in Education Transparency Act, championed by lawmakers from both parties who could no longer ignore the evidence. The law required all private schools receiving federal funds to publicly report their discipline patterns, resource distribution, demographic data, and all discrimination complaints. Schools that failed to comply faced immediate loss of funding and federal review. Within the first year of the law's implementation, dozens of schools across the country voluntarily reformed their policies, unwilling to risk the consequences that had brought Hudson Elite to its knees. Advocacy groups praised the act as one of the most significant civil rights reforms in modern education. Alexander attended the signing ceremony with Amelia at his side, their hands intertwined as the president acknowledged their courage, stating, "Because one family refused to accept silence, thousands of children will now be protected." Amelia's life, once marked by fear and isolation, blossomed into something far larger than she had ever imagined. She had regained her voice, not through loud speeches or defiance, but through steadfast truth-telling and the resilience that grew from surviving what should never have happened. She returned to debate, rediscovering the confidence that had once made her a champion. She excelled academically, pouring her energy into the subjects she loved: history, literature, and political science. She volunteered with youth advocacy groups, speaking quietly but firmly to students who needed reassurance that their voices mattered. Her story, now known across the country, became a source of strength for children who had experienced discrimination in silence. When the day of her graduation arrived, the school gathered under clear spring skies, families filled the lawn, teachers lined the aisles, and the renovated campus seemed to breathe differently, as though the ground itself had released the weight of its past. Amelia walked to the podium as valedictorian, her graduation gown moving gently in the breeze, her father watching her with a mixture of pride and tenderness. She began her speech with measured calm, her voice carrying across the lawn with practiced control. "There was a time," she said, "when I believed that disappearing would keep me safe, when I believed that if I stayed quiet, the world around me would change on its own." She paused, letting the silence settle. But silence does not heal anything. Silence only protects the people who cause harm. I learned that change begins when someone refuses to look away. She spoke about the students who had supported her, the teachers who found courage, and the community that demanded accountability. She ended with a message that echoed far beyond the school grounds. "I once wanted to disappear. Now I want to be seen, so no child ever has to hide again." The audience rose in a standing ovation. Some parents wept openly. Teachers who had once felt powerless now clapped with conviction. And Alexander, who had watched his daughter carry a burden no child should bear, felt a fierce sense of gratitude that she had not been broken by what happened. After the ceremony, they walked together to the entrance of Amelia Thompson Equity Hall, where the sunlight fell warmly across the engraved plaque. Alexander placed a hand on her shoulder and said softly, "One lunch changed everything." Amelia looked up at him with a small, knowing smile. "No, Dad," she replied. "One father who refused to look away changed everything." In the quiet moments that followed, they stood side by side, no longer defined by the suffering behind them, but by the strength that had grown from their refusal to accept it. The institution that once forced her into a dark corner now bore her name as a promise to future generations. And as they walked away from the school gates, leaving behind the place that had once held her in silence, the story closed with a call to every person who might one day face injustice. If you witness harm, record it, speak it, act on it, because somewhere at this very moment, a child is sitting in a dark corner, waiting for the right adult to finally stand up. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it so more voices can be heard.